There's these biological systems that keep us fit, keep us healthy. And if we're not careful to take good care of them, they too will wane in their power to defend us. And that's actually how we wind up getting sick.
As you were describing that, Dr. Lee, I was thinking about a bath, right? And I was thinking, okay, well, if an overflowing bath, when the water goes up and it starts to leak out, if that's the disease, or let's say that's cancer, every day we're sort of filling up our bath, let's say. But as long as the drain's working well, the water's staying down, it's not getting to the top. But if we're doing enough stuff that's actually blocking that drain, then actually we're not going to be able to repair the rising water level, and that water level is going to sort of spill out, and then we've got a disease, then we've got cancer. It's probably not a perfect analogy, but do you think there's something in that?
Yeah. Let me kind of build on what you just said. So you've got the drain keeping the water flowing and clean and at the right level, and you've got the water coming in, and that balance of where the water line needs to be. Now let's add some more. Now let's take a garbage pail filled with food bits, and now let's pour those in the drain as well. Okay. Yeah. Now you're contaminating the water. And if you have more of the drain opening to remove those bits, you're going to keep the water clean. But if you actually stop up the drain, then the garbage starts to accumulate. And that's actually part of the problem as well, is damage to our body accumulates over time. And that's why the bad decisions that we make really take, over the course of months or years, they have a consequence. And the good decisions also have the same type of time honored ability to build up on our behalf.
Well, in terms of empowering people, in terms of what they can do, and this is what a lot of your work is about, food has power here. Specifically, we're talking about DNA damage. Food has the ability to, make that drain bigger or put new drains in the bath, so there's more ability to kind of repair the damage. So, we're talking again about these 5 defense systems. I've gone straight in for number 4 that you mentioned, DNA. Could you maybe mention some foods that we can think about consuming that might have an impact on this particular defense system?
Yeah, well, so some amazing research has been done looking at which foods can help protect our DNA. And some of them are very ordinary, like a kiwi fruit that you might eat at breakfast. That brown fuzzy ball, you cut it open, it's got this emerald green interior with a little white starburst. It's kind of tart and sweet at the same time. Well, that kiwi is packed with vitamins and antioxidants. And it's been shown that eating just one kiwi a day can actually cause your blood to be fortified to neutralize about 60% of the incoming damage from DNA. And if you eat 3 kiwis a day, okay, which is pretty easy, right? I mean, you peel it, you cut it up, you put it into a yogurt, okay? It's something that's simple, actually will help your DNA build itself back up so that damaged DNA will be repaired. So don't forget, think about the way of protecting your DNA. I remember an old video game called Missile Command. And this is where from the top of the screen, there are all these missiles that are descending down on your planet. And what you had to do is to be able to fire and try to neutralize all the missiles. And that's what antioxidants actually do. But it's really hard to prevent all the missiles from coming in. And so occasionally you actually have one that gets through the shields and creates a crater. That's damage. And so neutralizing the incoming is like antioxidants, but building back the damaged DNA, well, that's important too, because that's like patching a pothole in the highway, in the roadside, so other cars don't have a problem on it. And so here's an example of a food, a kiwi, that can actually do that. But there are other foods that can also have varying degrees of protection of your DNA as well.
Yeah, it makes me happy, that example, because my dad, who's no longer alive, I remember as a kid, Dr. Lee, he used to say to me, keep eating kiwi fruits. He'd come back from the supermarket with, these bags of kiwi fruits. So they're really, really good for you. They're rich in vitamin C. Which of course is true, but obviously you're taking it up a notch now. You're saying, yes, it's rich in vitamin C, but actually it's also helping us repair DNA. And I guess to me, there's a wider point here, which is, my dad, 20, 30 years ago, probably said it's rich in vitamin C. So thought there was a value on feeding his children that food because of the impact on our health. And as science progresses, I guess we're learning more about the magic of this, quite ordinary food, the kiwi fruits. It makes me wonder, how much about food do we still not know? Like we're learning. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like we think we know so much, and of course we know more than we knew 20 years ago, but what are we going to find out in 10 years and 20 years about the magical properties of these foods?
Well, what you're actually talking about is what I'm working on, which is a new field of research called food as medicine. So the slogan or the saying food as medicine was attributed to Hippocrates, 3,000 years ago. But in fact, back then there were no medicines. So food was the only thing that was around. Today we have a lot of medicines. And it's because in the quest to develop medicines, we've employed some really deep science, molecular biology, genomics. We can drill right down inside the cell to figure out what happens and why and what the consequences are and how the cells work together. Well, one of the reasons that I went into nutrition was because I realized that food was something that could be used for prevention. You wouldn't want to use drugs for prevention. But the problem with food, nutrition, the criticism that many of us in the medical world have, about the idea of using food for healing was historically it was the lack of evidence, right? So we have a lot of evidence about drugs. We almost have nothing about foods. I mean, that's the dismissive tone that I think you probably were exposed to as well as I for most of our education. However, what's happening now, and I'm one of the people leading the charge in this, we can use the same technologies that are used to develop pharmaceuticals. And instead of throwing a drug into the system to see what happens, we can actually start to throw foods into those systems and see what happens as well. In fact, you can even compare foods and drugs and see which one wins. And that's something that I've been doing for the last decade, is really trying to use the same rigorous scientific methodology used for drug development in order to be able to study the impact of food.
Yeah, and I think you are in many ways uniquely placed to do this and move this field on, because you've got so much experience in the development of drugs and in research. So obviously you know how that whole system works. And because you are this way inclined to see the healing potential of foods, you can actually do that. And I feel that's really important to get that kind of traction, primarily with the medical profession, but also I think across wider society. I've had on the podcast all kinds of people on in the past talking about various aspects of food. You're like, Professor Felice Jacka from Australia, who conducted the SMILES trial, showing how food can impact and in some cases reverse depression. Dr. Drew Ramsey, this nutritional psychiatrist in New York, using food to help people with their moods. But I do think there's something very fresh about your approach that I really, really like and resonate with. This idea that food and drugs can be compared. Can you give us an example of that, where you've seen that food might have equal benefits, if not more benefits, than a drug?
Yeah, well, so we have been developing treatments for cancer that are designed to starve a cancer by cutting off its blood supply. And that's the process of angiogenesis that is hijacked by tumors, by cancer cells, to selfishly develop their own blood supply, right? So I told you the body has normal circulation to feed healthy tissues. Well, cancers can sometimes hijack that. So one of the new ways to treat cancer is actually to give a drug that can intercept a cancer's ability to recruit a private blood supply. That's starving a cancer, cutting off its blood supply, can't get oxygen and nutrients, can't grow. Okay, so I was one of the people to help develop the systems to develop those drugs. There have been over a dozen drugs that have been approved by health authorities to be able to achieve this in colon cancer, brain cancer, lung cancer, so on and so forth. Now, in that same system, we've actually thrown different food substances. And as an example, we took a drug that is a designer drug to stop angiogenesis, And then we actually also through blinded, so we didn't know which one was which, a substance that turned out to be the powdered extract from just regular green tea, a cup of green tea. And we found that they were, in that system, they went head to head against each other. And you could actually get the same effect in that test system. So now the question is, we've looked at this in the lab. How does this actually play out in real people, in the real world? Well, there are studies now that show that even 2 to 3 cups of tea a day can lower your risk of developing ovarian cancer, for example, by up to 50%. This is a gigantic study in Europe called the EPIC study that have looked at all the different food patterns and dietary consumptions over time to look for these correlations. And so food as medicine research is different from pharmaceutical research. Okay, pharmaceutical research, you take one pill or one drug and you get a group of people to make them as similar as possible. And then the only thing you do to people is give them that one drug, and everything else is, we hope, to control it so that there's no other variables. Well, foods can't be studied like that. You can't give somebody only green tea to drink for months at a time, or a tomato to eat. That's the only thing that you can eat. And foods don't work like drugs. I mean, a drug, you could squash a headache, in 20 minutes with a powerful drug or a migraine. But with food, the benefits of food, because it's so much more natural and because it leverages your body's own defense systems, the benefits take time and they build up over time. And so you're talking about research studies that could take months or years even to fully appreciate just how beneficial that is. So this is how we do food as medicine research. We look for benefits in real populations of real people, like people drinking green tea. How well does that prevent different types of cancer? Then we back it up to say, can we run a small clinical trial, a small group of people that we can control to see if we get a similar effect? Then we go back into the lab and we kind of say, well, now what happens if you feed animals that actually with green tea, can we, an animal subject, can we actually see that benefit? Then we can even go deeper and start going that mile deep. What happens at the cellular level? What happens at the genetic level? And so food as medicine is really taking that macroscopic community-wide level view and then drilling it right down to that molecular pathway. And so I happen to be one of the people that actually can traverse that entire journey with what I've done.
It's just so fascinating, very, very exciting about the future. That study you mentioned about a few cups of tea a day reducing your risk of developing cancer, was that black tea or green tea?
It's green tea, but black tea actually also has different benefits as well. So a study out of Italy did something really amazing. Well, so look, let's back up for a second. So what everybody would recognize is green tea. It's kind of like the kind of tea that you get in a sushi restaurant, Japanese restaurant, matcha. And it's very trendy. And of course, the trend goes back thousands of years in Asia. And then there's black tea, classic English breakfast tea or Earl Grey tea. In fact, I have a little tin of it. I happen to have a tin of Earl Grey tea here, right here. I love tea. And most people have said, this was the thinking previously, that green tea is really great for you because it's green. It's got filled with antioxidants, and it's got all these polyphenols in it. And black tea, well, when the British brought it back from Asia, they couldn't actually bring fresh green tea with this long ocean voyage. So they fermented and dried it. And that drying and fermenting actually destroys those polyphenols. So it doesn't have much good. Like, might taste good, but it doesn't really have the healthful properties. Well, this is where science, again, is able to heat up that knife and cut through the butter to kind of see exactly what the story is. And it turns out that black tea actually is quite active. I studied Chinese green tea, Japanese green tea, and studied Earl Grey. And so you can, besides comparing foods with drugs, you can compare foods with foods to find out which is the best kind. I was interested in, is Japanese sencha or Chinese green tea, jasmine tea, or is Earl Grey? Which one is better when you throw them into the system? And we found, actually surprisingly, that Earl Grey, the black tea with flavored with bergamot, actually was the most potent tea when you combined when you looked at all three side by side. other thing about black tea that's really amazing, it's been studied by researchers in Italy, is that black tea actually can call out those stem cells from your bone marrow to increase their levels in your circulation. And when your stem cells are circulating in your blood, they come out of their hiding spots in their storage container, the garage that the paint cans were stored in. They come out like bees flying out of a hive, and then they circulate in your body looking for organs to repair. So wherever you need a little bit of renewal, regeneration, your stem cells will fix it invisibly.
Yeah.
And so black tea can actually spark that repair and regenerative process.
As you are describing these different foods and their actions, I keep thinking back to this list of 5 defense systems that I'm just fascinated by. And obviously, we spoke about DNA, number 4, but you've now mentioned tea, I think, and green tea and black tea. It can impact stem cells, but it can also impact other parts of these defense systems. So presumably, are there some foods which only work on one defense system from the knowledge that we have so far, and other foods which can kind of hit more and potentially all 5 at the same time?
Yeah, well, so here's a principle of nature. Mother Nature tends to be incredibly clever and pack multiple roles in any given food. So while researchers may have only looked at one food in one particular way. So for example, I'm trying to think about something that would be useful from a whole food perspective that has only been found to do one thing. Actually, I have to say most of the foods that I know of that I've done research on, when you take a careful look, they can activate multiple health defenses. So I think that that's really where we're at, is really peeling back and discovering the utility, the multi-pronged utility of different foods.
That makes sense though, doesn't it? Because these defense systems, they don't work in isolation. They help, they obviously have to work as interconnected systems together. So it kind of makes sense that food, particularly food that's been around for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, are also going to have these multiple type effects.
Yeah.
If we go to angiogenesis, which you've already mentioned, and that was the first health defense system that you talked us through. This I found really, really interesting when researching your work. Your TED Talk, which of course has been viewed by millions of people now, there was a really interesting slide towards the end where I very much resonate with this idea. What's the root cause of multiple diseases? Can we, address the root cause, and then we're automatically going to take care of multiple different downstream consequences. And that was a very powerful slide showing that when angiogenesis is working well, or when it's not working well, what can happen in the body. Could you just talk us through that lens, angiogenesis? Because I think that's really interesting. And then you also mentioned cancer and blood supply. And again, could you just talk to us about cancer and how it can only grow to a certain size unless it gets its own blood supply as well, please?
Yeah, sure. Our circulation is these blood vessels, this network, and the blood is really the vehicle that carries oxygen and nutrients and everything else that our cells need to survive. So when we have the right amount, all of our organs are functioning properly. Sometimes we need a few extra blood vessels. So if you're working out and trying to build your muscles, when your muscles get bigger, it requires more blood vessels, bigger blood supply, no problem. Your angiogenesis system can actually supply and help to grow more of those blood vessels, but they keep it in proper volume. So not too many, not too few blood vessels. Very important principle of angiogenesis. That's health. We have good circulation. Now, here's what happens in disease. When you don't have enough blood vessels, what are some of the typical diseases that occur when you don't have enough blood flow? Well, one of the things is after a heart attack, if you cannot grow enough blood vessels, parts of your heart will get weaker. You can get heart failure, and a heart attack can actually be even fatal if you have inadequate blood vessels to try to bypass any temporary blockage. Same thing as a stroke. We know after there's a stroke, sometimes a clot gets sent to the brain and results in that type of stroke. your angiogenesis defense system is scrambled to be able to immediately generate tiny little bypass vessels, get around that blockage to save the brain beyond the blockage. If you can't get enough blood vessels growing in that situation, parts of your brain die, and you wind up being paralyzed or having deficits after a stroke. In diabetes, many people with diabetes lose their legs. They have their legs amputated, mostly because they have problems healing wounds on their feet.
Yeah.
Now, the reason is because their nerves actually they go numb. Their nerves die back, diabetic neuropathy. And the reason that the nerves die back is because there's inadequate blood vessels feeding those nerves. So now in diabetes, some of those nerves in your feet and even your fingertips actually don't have enough blood supply. They die. When the nerves die, you can't feel when you step on a pebble and you create a little hole. That hole gets infected. That wound now also won't heal because it doesn't have enough blood vessels. That's an example of inadequate angiogenesis and it causes a problem. And so now medical treatments actually have been designed to actually try to stimulate more blood vessels, to coax more vessels in where they're needed, but foods can also help do it as well. On the flip side, when you have too many blood vessels, and this is where cancer comes into play, it turns out that we all have cancer in our body. I mean, everyone fears cancer. The word actually, causes a shiver to run down most people's spine. Yeah. Everyone knows somebody who's been touched by cancer. And I would say most people know somebody who's died of cancer, actually. And so this is actually one of the most fearsome diseases, but yet biologically, we are actually all forming cancers in our body all the time, because all it takes for our 40 trillion cells to do is to make those little mistakes. Remember, I told you 10,000 mistakes are fixed every day. A few of those stinking through will turn into a microscopic tumor, microscopic cancer. And this is called cancer without disease, because a tiny little mutant cancer can grow up to the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen, and then it's frozen like a pimple. Can't go any bigger because it doesn't have a blood supply. No oxygen, no food, nothing to feed it. And so those little microscopic cancers sit there until another one of our defense systems, our immune system, wings by like a cop on a beat and sees this abnormal cell sitting on that street corner in a good neighborhood, and then says, "Get in the car, we're taking you away." And so our immune system destroys these microscopic cancers. But some microscopic cancers are able to hijack our body's regular angiogenesis defense system and selfishly grow blood vessels to feed themselves. Now, I worked in a lab studying angiogenesis, and we discovered that once an avascular or bloodless cancer is able to get vessels to touch it, the moment that touches it, the cancer can grow 16,000 times in 2 weeks. So literally, angiogenesis out of control is a trigger, an explosive trigger for tumor growth. And in fact, we know that if you can cut off the blood supply or prevent tumors from growing their blood supply, you can actually keep these cancers harmless for long periods of time. And so this is what foods are able to do. Foods that inhibit angiogenesis, they won't stop the good blood vessels from growing, because good blood vessels are actually solidly locked into your body. Your defense system ensures you're not going to get rid of your good blood vessels with food, but those extra blood vessels tend to be fragile, and those are the ones that the foods that we eat, and then if necessary, drugs that we can prescribe can really just kind of shear those extra vessels away.
Yeah, this whole sort of field of angiogenesis and blood vessels, I think, is going to be fascinating for people, because I think many people, everyone's aware that they've got blood vessels inside them. I think a lot of people will think, I sort of learned this in biology at school, that there's the heart and it, the blood vessels, it pumps oxygen around the body. That's how oxygen gets to all my muscles and organs. But potentially it kind of ends there. Like, it doesn't go beyond that. And what I love about that explanation is when angiogenesis is not working well, we're not able to make new blood vessels where we need to, it can cause a whole multitude of different diseases. But also when it's kind of out of control or gets to these cancer cells, too much angiogenesis can cause problems. And therefore the question for me, Dr. Lee, is, if angiogenesis sits at the heart of multiple different conditions, so we can look at it as a root cause, we also say similar things about chronic unresolved inflammation, don't we? We talk about inflammation being a root cause of lots of these chronic diseases. So can you speak a little bit about the relationship between inflammation and angiogenesis? Because it strikes me that they can't be separate. They probably sit side by side together in most cases.
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. I actually worked on research exactly looking at that interrelationship. So
Wow.
we know, well, let's take a look at just sort of something everybody recognizes, and to show how inflammation and blood vessel growth go hand in hand. If you are in the kitchen and you accidentally cut you're cutting a piece of fruit and you accidentally cut your finger or cut your hand, what's going to happen? It's going to bleed. All right. Now, so you're going to stop the bleeding. Then a few minutes later, you look at the cut. What's going to happen? It's swollen. It's puffy. It's red because inflammation's actually gotten there. Your immune defenses have sent these inflammatory cells. These are kind of super soldiers from our immune system that go there to kind of clean up and prevent any bacteria from rushing into that site. And then shortly thereafter, within a day or so, new blood vessels start growing because the inflammatory cells, the cells from your immune system, started to release some signals to say, hey, you know what? We've cleaned up. It's time to reset the table. And so now blood vessels actually start to grow into it. So inflammation sends the signals for wound healing, that for blood vessels to grow. By the same token, inflammation then goes away, which is why our wounds don't stay puffy the whole time. The puffy and redness goes away. The blood vessels grow, you get a scab, and before long, you're back to normal. And that's because both inflammation is turned down, turned off, like that's that car volume of the car radio, and also angiogenesis, once you get enough, it stops. And so this is getting back to that set point. Now, what happens when you actually have chronic anything? Usually it's not a good result. So inflammation being really good, a little bit is really good. So, I think a lot of people misunderstand. Like, I want to get rid of all the inflammation in my body. No, you don't, because you want the ability of your body to be able to mount small amounts of inflammation when needed for a short period of time and then to go away. All right. That's you want that. That's life-saving. But what you don't want is for that inflammation to get there and the volume to keep turning up, or that it never gets turned back down. That's chronic inflammation, and that's abnormal. So your body, this whole idea of turning up and then turning down the volume for inflammation, if you can't turn it down, the inflammation continues to smolder in your body. An example I've given is sort of like for anybody who's listening who's enjoyed going camping.
Yeah.
You go into woods, you set up a tent, it gets cold at night. What do? You build a campfire. And that's like a little bit of inflammation, gives you warmth that serves its purpose. And, when it's time to go to bed, you either let it burn down and you just, make sure that it's all walled off and you're fine. But that fire, if it doesn't burn down, but actually spills out and catches the forest on fire, now you actually got a problem because now this thing is going out of control. And diseases with chronic inflammation, like lupus, like rheumatoid arthritis, like diabetes, frankly, you wind up actually having this chronic inflammatory state that starts to provoke all kinds of other things. And remember, we talked about tumors and angiogenesis. Well, if a tumor is kind of like a wound, it can hijack blood vessels, and you got inflammation, and now the cancer itself causes some inflammation, you're just making it a hell of a lot easier for that tumor to get a blood supply, which means that the cancer is more likely to grow. And in fact, we do see this in patients who are actually chronically inflamed. We know that inflammation is one of those hallmarks for people who develop cancer.
One of the things I really liked about your approach was you said, well, let's put into our body foods that support these 5 defense systems. And if we can do that and support them, we raise the bar, we become more resilient. Therefore, we've got more headroom to actually deal with the insults that are going to come in life, whether that's DNA insults from pollution, or whether it's the odd thing that we creep into our diet that we probably know isn't the best thing for us, but we just fancy it now and again. And I really like that approach. And I know we're starting off this conversation focusing on some of the things to avoid. We're very quickly going to get onto the things that people can put in. But yeah, I really, really appreciate that.
The most important thing that we as doctors can do is to listen to our patients and hear them out and try to understand where they're coming from and what's important to them. I always ask my patients, what do you eat? What do you like to eat? What brings you joy when it comes to food? Though that question usually can elicit an answer. Like I'm very careful not to ask that question judgmentally. What kind of negative foods how much for steak do you eat? Like I never ask that. I always sort of say, like, tell me about what do you enjoy eating? What brings you joy? What are some of the favorite things that you like to eat? And, again, it's that conversation that invites someone to look deeply within them. I think that, when I was a kid, I studied martial arts, and one of the greatest martial artists ever was Bruce Lee, who I actually read a lot of his writings. He wrote in a philosophical sort of way, and he wrote one of the most important things that if to succeed in life, whether it's martial arts or otherwise, is to know yourself, to truly know yourself. And I think that so often we get distracted. We don't have that opportunity to ask ourselves something simple like, so if we had a choice, what would we want to eat? What brings us joy? And my strong belief is if we want people to get on a better diet, to get them started and to keep them going on it, we want them to actually feel like it's not a heavy lift. It's something that's doable. And I think there's nothing easier than to say, hey, you know what? Something that you already brings you pleasure and joy, something you enjoy to eat already is healthy. So let's start with those things because you already know you love them. So in my book, Eat to Beat Disease, I have lists of like 200 some foods. I always tell people, have my book, get a Sharpie. Okay. I say a Sharpie, like the marker, permanent marker, because it's permanent. You have to make a commitment. All right. Take a Sharpie, a black Sharpie, and circle the foods that you enlist that you already like. No, actually that you love. All right. And I don't care if it's just one or two. Almost everyone I've met has been able to circle like 10 of them. Or more. But if you find a food that you already love, that's healthy and good for you, that activates your health defenses, you are already way ahead of the game.
We'll be back to the conversation in just a moment. Now, many of us struggle to find time to eat all of these incredible whole foods. That's why I'm a big fan of good quality whole food supplements like this one that's been in my own life for over 3 years now. It contains over 75 whole food source ingredients, vitamins, minerals, pre and probiotics, and it can help us support our energy, focus, digestion, and our immune system. Athletic Greens are giving my audience a fantastic offer. 1 year's free supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first order. You can see all the details at athleticgreens.com/live more or simply click on the link below. Now, back to the conversation. Love that. Very empowering approach to people. Oils. Oils are something that can cause a lot of confusion. I know you're a big fan of olive oil. I want to talk about olive oil and why it's so beneficial. But before we get to olive oil, in the spirit of the kind of foods that we should think about limiting when we are in our supermarket or our grocery store, and we're looking around to purchase oils to cook food in, to sprinkle on food, to pour on our salads, what kind of oils should we try and avoid? And then what sort of oil should we try and buy instead?
So this, like the debate about artificial sweeteners, is a loaded topic. And so I want to just start, this component of our conversation by saying the jury is still very much deliberating what oils are harmful to you and are most harmful to you. But I think that it's less controversial what oils are better for you and good for you. I want to, for your listeners, I want to kind of give people some real practical things and not just kind of dive into the science of petroleum products, which is what oils are. Let's talk about this. Rule number one, regardless of what oil you actually have, what I would say is don't have too much of it because oils are fats and fats can be healthier, but there really isn't such a thing as a healthy fat that you should like drink lots of it every single day. Okay. So the point is that there are healthier oils, but we should all limit the amount of oil that we actually intake into our body. All right. Number one. Number two is that, and this is actually broadly speaking, is don't reuse your oil. Okay. Most oils that are reused, when we heat them to cook, whether we're actually, I mean, again, deep frying is generally something that's not very healthy. The process of deep frying actually changes the natural chemicals that make up oil in the oil itself, and then paint it onto the food, stick it onto the food. So we're eating some of the changed chemicals when we actually eat deep fried food. Now, look, I mean, I've had some awesome fish and chips when I visited England before. And again, as we talked about, every now and then, if you spend most of your time shoring up your health defenses, raising your own bar, having a rare treat is totally fine. But when you fry things in hot oil, you're also changing the chemical structure of things. That entire browning, golden browning, crisping of food actually changes the chemical structure of the food itself, and in ways that are potentially carcinogenic. And so just need to be careful about that. The third, so I think, like reusing oil, here's the thing that's kind of like a little risky. You go to a restaurant to eat, you have no idea if they're reusing their oil over and over and over again. I mean, think about in Asian restaurants, whether it's an Indian restaurant or a Chinese restaurant, they've got these gigantic vats where they're frying tasty little bits up, but they may be reusing that oil for days. So reused oil, not good for you, for sure. And the stuff that's fried in oil can also change in time. So let's start now talking about just like the properties of oils themselves. This is where I think, rather than kind of walk into the quicksand of trying to say, is palm oil better than corn oil? Is coconut oil dangerous for you? Like we can wade into that jungle with, but I think you need a machete to cut your way out of it. And so the best way to think about it, to help give clarity is, are there any healthier oils to use and how to use them? And this is where I think olive oil really stands out. Number one, it's part of a healthy pattern of eating that's been revered for thousands of years. And that's in the traditional Mediterranean diet. And the olives are seasonal, they're pressed. The extra virgin olive oil contains not just fat, monounsaturated fatty acids, which are better for your body and less damaging for your cardiovascular health. But there's a lot of polyphenols that come from the olive itself. Now, a lot of people don't understand this, but when you look at olive oil, the reason we say extra virgin olive oil, EVOO, that's what supermarkets and what restaurants are proud to use now, is because it's not just fat. It contains the polyphenols from the oil. So if you were to actually, by the way, this is a good experiment to do for your listeners, buy a little container of olives from your grocery store, de-pitted, make it easy for yourself. And literally, take it home and take a heavy glass, or take a board, like a heavy cutting board, and press those olives yourself. And you'll actually see, if you press hard enough, you'll see some oil come out of it. Now, in an olive oil factory, I mean, that's so you can actually appreciate where your food comes from, where your olive oil comes from. Now, when you actually press it, you'll see that you've crushed the olives. And some of the bits from the olives are actually in the olive oil. The reason that olive oil tastes so good, it's got that, kind of peppery, vegetal kind of quality to it. It's got an umami flavor. It's not because the fat is flavorful. It's because the bits of olives that were crushed in there are actually in there flavoring it. Now, those bits and the stuff that comes from the meat of the olives contain the polyphenols, one of which is hydroxytyrosol. Hydroxytyrosol sounds like a very complicated chemical name. Your listeners don't need to memorize it by any means, but you should know that comes from the olive. Now, olive oil will have some of it, only about 20% of it. But if you actually press that olive, 80% goes into the olive water, and it's stuck in the pulp. And so one of the things that I always say is that, if you really love olive oil and you want to get the most out of it, just eat the whole olive, and you can actually cut up an olive and you'll get a little bit of fat, you'll get all that flavor, and you'll get a lot more of the polyphenol. Now, if you're going to cook with olive oil, I always say go for extra virgin because of that reason. I would say don't deep fry, but you can you can put some on to food. You can actually saute with it, not too much. All the studies show that about 3 tablespoons of olive oil, sort of like what you probably, that's around the max of what you'd want a day. So nobody's drinking olive oil. And then the other thing that is, if you want to choose which olive oil, because I get overwhelmed when I walk into a store and I see all these, like a whole wall full of olive oils, right? Everybody's marketing. Here's what I do again. I pick up the olive and oil and I look at the ingredients. What do I look for? I look for monovarietal olive oil. Monovarietal means it's made with just one kind of olive. And I look for the one kind of olive that oil is made from 3 different varieties of olive. In Spain, Spanish olive oil, I look for Picual, Picual. Picual olives, among the highest in polyphenols in the oil. So the olive oil will be loaded. Second, Greek olive oil, the Koroneiki olive, which is from the Peloponnesus. Both the Picual and Koroneiki are very common olives, so that's a good news. It's not very expensive. Highest amount of one of the top 3 polyphenols. And the third, for Italian olive oil, I look for oil that's been pressed from a monovarietal called Moraiolo, and that comes from Umbria. And that's less common, harder to find, a little pricier. But I just gave you 3 olives, Picual, Koroneiki, Moraiolo, that are not, most of them are not good eating olives, but they're great for olive oil. They're packed with polyphenols. If you get olive oil that is monovarietal, pressed only from each of those, you can be guaranteed that you're getting sort of the capo de capo of the polyphenols in the olive oil.
Yeah, I love that. I actually, in my kitchen, as we speak now, is the Picual olive. It's, well, I would have called it a single origin, but that's because I'm probably used to picking coffee. But as you were describing that, there was such a wonderful energy in your voice and your body language. It reminded me of like a wine connoisseur talking about the different varieties of wines, or a coffee connoisseur talking about that, you know, I get the single origin bean from this particular farm. But I guess it's not that different, is it? It's about going back to, where does this come from? How was it processed? What is actually in my hand right now that I'm about to buy?
Yeah, and you know, there is great pride that we as humans have always had, and it's still within us, to know something about the food that is around us. I mean, you know, if you talk to a farmer, they are proud of what they have. If you talk to a villager, they're really proud of what grows around their community. And again, I think that, you know, something that maybe that we're fighting against, because I want to draw back the jargon that you raised at the beginning, that I think is helpful to think about. What are we really fighting against? You know, I think we're fighting against our distraction from ourselves, getting to know who we are, getting to know, slowing down so we can actually understand our own pace. We're getting distracted by the pace of what we're expected to do, and so we've got no time for ourselves, right? I mean, every young working parent certainly feels that way. Mm-hmm. You know, like, man, I'm so busy, I don't have time for myself. And yet, when it comes to food and health, we all need to have that time for ourselves. And I think we should take great pride in saying what it is that we actually love.
Yeah. A lot of people talk about the health properties of vegetables. Of course, you promote all kinds of vegetables which have different impacts on the body. But some of the time we're told to sprinkle or pour some olive oil onto the vegetables because it helps us absorb nutrients from them. What's your perspective on that, in view of what you've just said about oil and, you know, perhaps not over consuming it, even though it can be healthy?
Yeah, well, let's unpack that, because there's 2 things that you were describing. One is that in plants, let's take a tomato as a great example. There are natural substances, natural chemicals, like lycopene. Lycopene is a carotenoid. It helps to make the tomato red. It has lots and lots of healthful properties. It's a powerful antioxidant. I've studied lycopene in a laboratory, and it actually can help starve cancers by cutting off the blood supply. It can slow the shortening of telomeres to slow cellular aging, and it can actually protect our DNA from even sunlight and ultraviolet exposure. Lots of good things about it. Now, lycopene actually is a naturally occurs in a tomato on a vine in a chemical form that our body doesn't absorb that well. So if you pick a tomato off the vine and you cut it up and you throw it into a salad, it might taste great. Just got some vitamin C in it. It's a great source of hydration and great flavors. Okay, especially if it's like a homegrown heirloom type of tomato. But you're not going to get you're not going to get as much lycopene. You're probably only going to get maybe 20% of the lycopene that's in there. But you want to, like for me, I want to get as much of the good stuff as I can. So here's what research has found. If you wanted to convert that chemical structure of lycopene into a form that you can absorb better, your body can avidly absorb, what you want to do is you want to heat the tomato like in a pan, and with the heat will change the chemical structure from a form your body doesn't absorb that well into a form that your body avidly absorbs, loves to absorb it. Now you go from 20% absorption to 80% absorption. You flipped it around completely, upended that equation completely. Now you're really absorbing it. Now, here's one additional thing though. How would you heat a tomato in a pan? You heat it in water or nothing? No, not really. You put a little bit of olive oil in it. And why is that? And it's because lycopene is a substance that we call fat soluble. It's a lipid. It loves to dissolve into fats. So a little bit of olive oil in tomatoes on a pan, sauteed, so it's soft, change the chemical structure. Flavors are really great now. And you have that. Now when you eat that tomato sauce, sauteed in olive oil, the olive oil with the lycopene is carried into your body even more efficiently than if it were cooked in water. And so again, that's just one example of thousands of how oils with fat soluble foods. By the way, if you didn't want to look at olive oil, here's another common snack in the United States anyways, kind of tearing a page book from Latin American cuisine. You have these tortilla chips and then you wind up actually having a salsa and guacamole. The salsa is often sort of stewed down tomatoes, cooked down tomatoes, served room temperature or chilled. And then the guacamole is just avocado that's been smashed up. Now, avocado has a lot of healthy fats in it. It's a fat soluble veggie. It's actually quite nutritious. Remarkably, people eating avocado actually shrink their waistline because actually, even though they're eating fat, it actually it burns down harmful fat. It's a whole other story that we had. But if you have guacamole, avocado with tomatoes, you get more lycopene. And so that happens to be kind of a popular snack in the United States.
Yeah, I love that. So the right combination of foods can actually help absorb the nutrients. I think black pepper also can do that, right? With certain nutrients?
Well, right. So black pepper so this is an interesting thing. Most of us have heard that turmeric, which is a kind of a root, when you cut it open, it's this bright, beautiful, bright orange, a lovely color. And turmeric is also a dried spice used in Southeast Asian cuisine, including Indian cuisine, is where I first became acquainted with it. It not only makes food beautiful, it actually makes food delicious. It's got quite a lovely taste to it. It's a spice. Inside turmeric is curcumin. Curcumin is one of those natural chemicals, kind of like lycopene. It's one of those Mother Nature's treasure chest, Mother Nature's pharmacy with an F, not a PH. And the curcumin has a lot of properties: anti-inflammatory, it's antioxidant, it cuts off the blood supply feeding cancers. It actually is helpful for your stem cells as well. It really activates almost all of your body's health defenses, and it's good for your gut microbiome. So why not just, enjoy turmeric as a spice by itself? Because it's so potent that our body actually doesn't absorb everything that it could. In fact, our body kind of gets, a lot of it gets flushed out, at the tail end. And so what we want to do to improve our body's extraction of the good stuff, the turmeric, it turns out that if you have fresh cracked black pepper, all right, there's a substance in fresh cracked black pepper called piperine. Yeah. Piperine is one of